we are going to talk about our projects. This is what we are supposed to do. So we are going to show the projects and the ideas that generated those projects in the last years. Many of those projects are already built several years ago, so eventually you know them. Some others, at the end, you will see the projects in which we are working right now. In any case, we like to show them, and we are going to talk, both of us, showing one or another in different ways. We are going to talk about that in trying to transmit what becomes important for us when we approach architecture, how we see it. This has to do also with this fact that we work in many different situations, different countries actually nowadays, different programs. Our architecture is in many cases different when we approach a project in a particular circumstance or place or in another. And this leads us to try to explain in these few slides at the beginning how we see it. It's always difficult to interpret oneself, but sometimes when one has to do it, and for example, this happened when last year we were invited to have a rather large exhibition on our work that was organized by Francesco Dalcò. It was in Bologna in Italy. There was a book at the same time, and we put together a lot of projects that some of them were even forgotten for us at the time, many of them not built. But that made us think and discuss about which were those themes that became step by step, and I would say unconsciously, not at the very beginning it was like that, the themes that really were leading us to work the way we did. Yeah? So in one way, we presented our project like in an atlas, this sort of Abi Barbuk way of explaining that architecture is always the mirror of another one, using the words of George Perec, for example, that architecture always is a consequence of multiple circumstances and places and programs and ideas and experiences and memories that nevertheless at one point come together. And this is always the beginning of a project. But besides that, when we came here today, we decided to show also some image that is a text, which is a way we explained our project years ago, and then we forgot about that. But now, back again, we think it explains very well our approach as architects. It is a text that we wrote some time ago for a book, I think 10 or 15 years ago. It talks about memory. It talks about the memory of not only a collective memory, but our own personal experiences, how architecture is always a result of something that we have before in our own memory, or we perceived, or we read, or we listened to. But I don't bring it here simply to show the text. I bring it here as this sort of experiment in visual poetry. It was used that way. Imagine that we take away one letter, I don't know, P. You take away the P, and if you read it, I'm completely sure you still understand it. So probably this letter was in excess. Probably this erased letter should have been not there. So let's continue, and we take away another one, for example, an M. Then you look at the text, maybe it takes you a couple of seconds more, but you understand the text, so maybe that letter was in excess. With this idea in mind, we take another letter, we erase an E, and we erase another one, and we erase another one, and there's a moment when you do not understand, or we don't understand anymore the text itself. So we have lost the meaning that we wanted to transmit. And this idea became a sort of an analogy or metaphor of the way we approach architecture, or more than architecture, the process of defining architecture, in which many things come together that belong to our memory, to our experience, to the facts, the program, the technical facts, etc. But at one point, we always, and this is something we comment many times, we always try to go back and say, what if this is not needed? Or what if this is not? This is not minimalism. This would be a different thing. This is another way of thinking in which we only have to take away what is not strictly necessary to transmit the idea we wanted to. So this image of the missing letters or something like that recalls also many other arts and many other questions. For example, working in the archaeological sites that we have, for example, in Medina Alzara, this is a beautiful piece. You see the piece with the cracks, pieces are even missing, but we still recognize the original one. Or in a Chinese vase, for example, it's full of cracks, but nevertheless, the object, the space itself is still there. For example, the Islamic architecture with which we became familiar step by step after working for many years with these archaeologists in this Arabic city of southern Spain, is full of rich architectural ideas. It's pure geometry, as you know. We all use nowadays very much the word algorithm, and of course algorithm is no more than what these Arabs did at the time when using a couple of geometrical laws and combining them. Yeah? But when we look at the piece, again, like the missing letters, we can see a piece that has lost the color, or the blue, or the yellow, or it has lost the texture, or even some pieces are missing, and nevertheless, we understand the geometrical pattern that is behind. Architecture is always constantly talking about this idea of the missing ideas. Architecture of the past, historical architecture, the ruins, they were one day covered, with, as we know, with rich stuccos or marbles or stones. Many of them, not to say almost all of them, have been lost, and nevertheless, as we see in this case in this Cordoba building, we recognize the essence of this space. So maybe those elements were not needed. This is something that we recognize in many other places, in a castle in Germany that has been mentioned before, of the 15th century, that you see here in an image. It's something that if we think in other arts, for example in paintings, we can also perceive in a way this sort of metaphor. This is a church in the center of the city of Halle, 1 hour south of Berlin, this beautiful medieval church. When Feininger painted it, of course, he was not painting every single letter of so to say, of the building. He only chose those that were needed to express what he, as an artist, wanted to express in this church. Of course, the similarities could be many, and every time we start to think about that, we find another one. I'm sure you many others, but of course, music is always a clear reference, because music is very much about combination or combinatorial thinking, which is a way, in many cases, we have defined our own work, a combinatorial thinking in which we only have to define the minimum elements in order to achieve with variations the complexity of the piece, of the architectural object itself. Of course, Bach, like you see, this is a piece of Bach. Bach is very much in a fugue like this, about repeating, as you know, this theme with variations, and variations, a pure combinatorial music system. But also the notation that you can see there is full of this richness that the music of Bach transmits. But if we see another partiture, in this case of a contemporary composer with whom we are working now, we are building his foundation in Estonia. This is Arvo Pärt. Again, we are talking about variations of one single theme. Just in the case of an artist, for example, like Arvo Pärt, we could say that the silence or the absence, I would say, of these elements, the notes, the sounds, is so important as the notes or the sounds themselves. So we could, even in the images and the drawings that Arvo Pärt does of his own music, his own notation, is expressing this idea of the void that we like to compare to the silence in his music. So this list of, at the end, personal interpretations, references, is something that belongs to our own world, that they come back and forth on this sort of visual poetry example, that at the end can be synthesized in this idea that we try always to find out the minimum number of elements that are able to be combined in different ways, so that at the end whether we talk about geometry or architecture or painting or music or visual arts, we are talking about the same conceptual idea that is behind. But today we define this lecture with this idea of 5 themes, because when we revised our work for this exhibition and book that was published last year, so we really found out that these themes that are expressed here with very simple words, in some other cases we have used similar but different words, they're talking about elements, really elements of architecture that are deeply rooted in what we understand an architectural work deals with, of course, the ground. Many of these ideas are not, by the way, were rejected or forgotten by the modern architecture of the 1920s and the 20th century. For example, the ground itself of working below ground. This would be one, the roof. The roof is the second one, the void or the space in between. The fragment, understood the fragment as piece of a historical precedent, and the pattern, which at the end refers to everything. So the projects we're going to see from now on, one way or another, refer to these 5 themes. The ground as a landscape in many cases, which is in many occasions the origin of the project, but sometimes it's also the ground of the city itself, this level that we don't pay very much attention usually, but it's a place where we live. Yeah? This would be one. But of course, the roof that I mentioned before became at one point a quite interesting thing for us, maybe because it was denied by modern architecture, and we were teach at the time, so many, I guess many of us, influenced, of course, by Le Corbusier, by Mies, by Bauhaus, that the roof should be flat, and that's it. But of course, at the same time, we like to travel very much, and we know that the cities are defined by the skyline, and the cities that you see from above become something else. So at a certain point, and I guess that all these ideas came unconsciously to us, the roofs started to become not only, let's say, an important thing, they started really to become the origin of the very project itself in many of these projects. If we talk about the void, we're talking about space, but we're talking about space in a more interesting way for us, which is a sort of interstitial space. So in some of our projects, we believe the space in between, the interstitial space, something that apparently becomes a lateral thing compared to the main spaces of a project, become for us, nevertheless, the key question of them. And the fragment refers to the idea of memory, refers to the idea of working with the past, which happened to be the case in many of the projects we have been working in the last years. So fragment, ruin, memory are different words or different concepts that refer to how contemporary architecture dialogues with the existing historical building. And finally, pattern, series, combinatorial thinking, whatever finally word we use, will refer to this theme that is actually the leitmotif of the whole work, which is these variations of very simple themes.
And we are going to go now to the city of Halle, in the north of Germany, at the border of the river Saale. In this city, in the 15th century, the Archbishop of Brandenburg decided to build a beautiful castle, the castle of Morisburg, which was a castle that had a very short life, because it was built and it was really destroyed very quickly in the War of the 30 Years, and it was never built again. It came to the 20th century without being rebuilt. And so in the city of Halle, it was really known as the ruin. In fact, it was painted a lot of times, always with this romantic idea of the ruin, this romantic German idea of the ruin. This picture that you're seeing now, it belongs to the collection of the museum that is now in the Morisburg, in the Morisburg castle. 2 of the wings of the castle were restored for the museum like 20 years ago, and then there was a second competition in order to extend and to restore the other 2 wings, the north and the west wing. So when we entered the competition, we found the Morisburg castle in this situation in which it was still a ruin, and for us it was very important to understand that it was perceived as a ruin, and it was linked to the city, to the city of Halle, thinking of it as a ruin. So in the inside, we found these existing walls, which were very important for us. And we tried to understand the importance of these walls for the city, as I said before. Also for us important was these roofs and their very dramatic geometrical way of being solved. Roofs that were also, roofs like this of this church that were painted by Feininger, which is one of the painters of the collection of the art that was going to be shown in the Morisburg Museum. So for us, it was very important to understand and to work also with this very beautiful geometry that Feininger had in these pictures when we were thinking of the building. So, in a way, it was clear what we had to do, because what we really proposed was a new landscape, a new roof landscape. A new landscape that was going to dialogue with the existing roofs of the city, and at the same time was going to be solved with the geometry that was used by the painters that were going to be shown in the building. And at the same time, it was not only a roof, but it was also structure. In this way, we could simply drop the roof on the walls of the existing building, and we didn't need any other structure to be holding the extension of the extension that we were asked for in this for this project. So really the extension were the hanging boxes from the roof, which allowed us, as you see in the photograph, of keeping the existing ruin and really working with the walls that we had already found when we started to build this project and we entered the competition. Like this, what we were really doing was putting in contrast and in dialogue the two architectures, the contemporary architecture and the already existing architecture, and it was really more dramatically seen in spaces like this, in these interstitial spaces, like for example in these stairs, or in these areas where we want to keep the distance between the old and the new architecture. In the new exhibition areas were simply white exhibition areas for contemporary art that received the light from the skylights of above. So really, here we have the roof seen in the model, and I hope that you can understand the ideas that we had in order to establish this dialogue, not only with the geometry of the drawings of the Feininger, of the painters, but also with the already existing roofs. Very important for us, of course, was the election of material. And we decided to go for this material to work with aluminum, because in a way the aluminum has this condition special that it nearly disappears in the white skies that are normally in this way of the city of Halle. So it gives us also more the idea that the roof is floating on top, simply floating on top of the already existing walls. Also, this material allowed us to be able to build this very complicated geometry. So it allowed us to build these very straight angles that we wanted to give to the new skylights. We were working with plates of aluminum of 1 centimeter, and as you can see, that also allowed us to have a very precise construction, as you can see in the lines, how the lines get together and meet together in the skylight. We always like to show our buildings with the human figure, because like that you can understand really the dimension and the scale of the roof in which we are talking about. So you see now the roof regarding the human figure and the city of Halle in the back. Of course, it's not so easy to go up to the roof because it's not allowed, but we managed to do it in the day that the roof was going to be finished, and the people that you see there are the people of our office that were working in the project. And also with this geometry, as Jorge was explaining before, we also decided to take down part of the roof and to build a new tower, not only the entrance door, but also a new tower. A new tower built with the same geometry and with the same material, and that is a service tower that was used for putting up the art in the museum. So for us, working with roofs, as we have said before, is very important. As Enrique said before, for us, working roof means working with natural light and working with sections. Of course, and sometimes even the roof comes to be the concept of a project, like in this other project that I'm not going to show, which is done in Zaragoza, and all the concept of the project came out of the idea of a roof that was going up and down to form the building. Another very special roof is this one, a roof in the city of Graz on top of a building, because in this case, the whole project is a roof, and we are working with a roof in the city of roofs, because now we are in the city of Graz. Graz is a city of Austria, a town in Austria, and it's a very special town because it's protected. It's a historic town that is all of the center, not one building, is protected by UNESCO. And is especially protected because of this image here. Of course, this is an old image, but the roofs of the city have been kept pretty much in this way. So UNESCO has protected all of the center area because of the quality of its roofs. In this city of Halle, we entered a competition for the restoration and extension of the roof of a department store in the center of the city. The department store was located in these two buildings of the early 20th century, late the 19th century, and 18th century, the one beside. And of course, in the inside is completely changed, and the roofs are not exactly how I was showing in the photograph, because they have a lot of things that are appearing on top of the roofs. So during the years, all the installations and modifications, anything that the building needed was really located up in the roof. So when this department store needed an extension, the owners of the department store went to speak to the people of the City Hall and also of UNESCO in order to tell them that they were going to take out the upper part of the roof if they were able to extend the building with one more floor. So they organized a competition in which we entered, and this is the project that we presented. And what we were trying to do here is we're trying to solve the roof by understanding the ground of the city. We were trying to put the life of the city on the roofs. And at the same time, we were doing it with a pattern, with a geometrical pattern. So we were solving the roof with the same piece, one skylight that was going to be modified in order to adapt and to adjust to the necessities of the project. This is a model that we built, and I don't know if you appreciate it, but it's a little bit different than the drawing that I had shown before. Because of course, for us, this project was we learned a lot in this project because we had to go through a lot of discussions with the people of UNESCO. I don't know if you see it in this drawing, but you see all the different lines. I don't know if you appreciate the color, but they are yellow, red, blue, in all different colors, because they are the different modifications to which we had to go through because they were asked for us by the people of UNESCO. And of course, we could do it because we had organized the project, or we had thought about the project really as a system. So for us, it was easy to be able to modify the project because we didn't change the concept. So we were still working with the same skylights, but we were able to modify the situation of them and even the heights. Here, you have to understand that in this project, as I said in the beginning, we are only working in the roofs and in the connection with the stairs with the rest of the building. Here is the model only of the roof, and well, the building is one of these situations in which the building was starting to be in use before it was finished. So here you see the unfinished building already in use with a lot of people enjoying the terraces. And well, in the next image here, you see on the right side these letters that are saying the bronze will come. So now the building is in use, and we will have to continue it in a couple of years, I hope next year, in order to be able to see it in this way as we had originally thought about it. We are going to go to another project, and that is curiously in the same city, because what happened here is that more or less at the same time, we won two different competitions in the same city. And it's also very incredible for us because it was in opposite situations. If in the last one we were working in the roofs, here we are working in the ground. We entered a competition to extend these three buildings, which is a fine art museum of the 19th century, a science museum of the 18th century, and the library, the three buildings that are in color. All of them belong to the Joanneum institution. So we had to make the restoration of the buildings and also an extension for the common areas of the three buildings. So looking at the situation, what we decided to do is to add one more use to what we were asked for, because we thought that we were going to solve it with a public plaza, a public space for the city that was going to connect the two areas of the city and was going to create this public area. And under it, under the public area, and through these different perforations, we were going to organize the new spaces. The new spaces, as you see in section, that were going to connect the two existing buildings, which were not going to be touched. We only worked on them with restoration. And underneath, we work with these cones. It's really the same figure, the same element, again, as in the other situation, in which we cut the cone in different sections in order to organize the space around them. So with these patios or these perforations, we organize the entrance and the entrance of people and also the entrance of light to the under space to the new space. And here also, for us, it was important to establish, as we do in the other project, a dialogue between the two architectures, the new architecture and the old architecture. And we did that by the reflection of the old buildings, that there was a continuous reflection of the buildings in the cones. So whenever you are in the space inside, you always perceive the buildings outside in a different way, establishing then a relation between the two architectures. The building outside, the plaza outside, as you see, with the different cone perforations. And for us, it was this very strange situation of working in the same city and in the ground, which is one of our themes, and in the roof, which is another of our themes. So, because we saw this situation, we asked to a young group of video artists called Nessun Dorma to do us a video that what we asked them was to relate the different situations of working in the ground and working in the roofs.
Well, this work, these two works, they relate to these themes that are coming back and forth, the roof, the roofscape, the ground. But they deal also, and that's clear for us in almost every project, with this idea that the space in between the void, in a way, becomes also the key question of the project. Let's see another project that was actually built before those, which is the one we are going to see, that has this idea of working with the void as the main original theme of the project. We are here in Madinat al-Zara, or Medina Zara, as we say in Spanish. Madinat al-Zara is the Arab name, because this is one of the most amazing archaeological sites in Europe, and definitely the most important in the Islamic world in Spain. This is an old city, a city that was built in the year 940, so many years ago. It was destroyed in the year 1010, so almost exactly 1,000 years ago. And it was destroyed, and it remained a ruin till the end of the 19th century, when it was rediscovered, and then the excavations started again. You see that it's an amazing landscape in the Sierra of Cordoba. It was the city built by this caliph with a very clear geometrical figure. It is a perfect double rectangle. Only a 15% of the city has been discovered. And in this place, there was a competition like 15 years ago, actually, that we won, with an idea that was leading the whole process of the project. The idea was more, again, an analogy of the work of the architect. We said, literally, in the competition, we shall not work as architects, but as archaeologists. In other words, we are finding the building below, the museum, the archaeological ground below, and as a consequence, of course, this sort of metaphor brings a building that is built below ground. So the whole building, as you see in this image, plays with this idea that at the same time that the archaeologists are finding the ruins of the old Arab city of Madinat al-Zara, we, the architects, were working nearby and finding the building of the museum or the visitor center that we were asked to do. This idea was important because then the whole project was not linked to a specific form, but rather to a way of working that deals with the way the materials are used, the geometry, etc. The plan explains this idea that the voids are the origin of the plan. So there is a central square that organizes the main space. There are longitudinal spaces. Some of them are deep and narrow. Some of them are more open. They all bring the light to a a completely buried building, a building which is really below ground. When you see the building once finished, it becomes part of this landscape. It almost disappears. It's only at some point a little bit higher than the level of the floor. When you see it in the distance, it establishes also relationships that are important because, as I mentioned before, with this idea of the atlas, our mind is full of experiences and memories, and of course the memory of the Andalusian, southern Spain, agricultural buildings, these cortijos, these large white houses that you see there, were also part of the idea. The whole building is built in one material, which is white concrete. White concrete is floor, walls, slabs, etc. It's also a matter of relating to the history of the city. The city is called Madinat al-Zara, that, as they told us, in Arab means something like the brilliant city or the shiny city, because it was all white at the time, and red only in the roofs in some parts. The building uses this idea of the analogy with the historical ruins of the Arab city, not by means of figurative relationships at all. As you can see, the architecture is a rather abstract white architecture, but by means of the presence of these perceptive questions of architecture, for example, the roughness of the material, the sound of the water in the fountain, of course, the smell of the orange, the scent of the orange trees, etc., etc. So some of the patios that bring the light are really deep and narrow. I mean, we are in the southern Spain, completely different from Graz that the Fuensanta just saw when we have to bring the light in Central and Northern Europe. In Spain, southern Spain, we have to protect from the light in a way. So all the natural light is coming basically through these patios, not through windows. Even the museum is a whole space made of white concrete, in this case of 2 floors, 7 meters below. Only one part of the building is higher. You go up this stair, and then there is a place where you have a window, and then you have a view to the ruins that you are going to visit in the distance. The building inside incorporates also the definition of the museographic installation that we also had the chance to do, using only another material, which is the red corten steel, and also the main specific and more important pieces of the archaeological site that are shown, as you see, in the museum itself. But for us, the series of images explain better what we try to do. In a way, it all has to do with this idea of a memory and an invention, which is a theme we have used in other lectures and texts, that of course relates to this idea of how contemporary architecture establishes a dialogue or a conversation, I would say, with the historical past without needing to repeat at all mimetically the architectural language, but rather trying to understand that new and old, even though they're separate, they share many of the same intentions. The building of Medina Zahara, through the whole palace city, was covered with what you see here, a white stucco and a red stucco. That's the reason of the decision about the materials. Our project was done only with white concrete, as we said, but also with red corten steel, that in a way represents this sort of parallelism to this one they call shiny city with red roofs. So the whole roof is simply a sort of I would say even a land art installation. That was our intention. It's simply a series of very large corten steel plates put on top of this very flat space, which is carved in a way with these voids into the landscape of this agricultural landscape of Andalusia. So it's a building that relates to this idea of the ground and how the ground becomes the project. So another project that was mentioned before and that deals also with this complex situation between old and new, between urban say landscape and artificial landscape or natural landscape is in the city of San Sebastián. Here we are in Spain again, in the Basque Country, in the north of Spain, in one of the most beautiful cities that I recommend you to visit, in an area that was really the origin of the city. If you see this peninsula that once was an island, it's called the Monte Urgul, the Mount Urgul. That was the origin of the city that you may recognize in the view, in the aerial view. The old city that is exactly the first part that you see there, and that was rebuilt after the Napoleonic Wars in the beginning of the 19th century, nevertheless kept a couple, 2 or 3 of the old historical churches that were there before that time. Actually, this was one of them, which is a convent of San Telmo, a 16th century building that was already a museum since the 1930s, and that had needed a very large extension and refurbishment and restoration. So the competition we won, you see it there, deals with this idea of the limit as a theme, the limit between natural and urban landscape. A limit in a city like San Sebastián that shows it constantly. You see the mountain and you see the streets, or you see the sea, the impressive sea, and nearby the beach, and then you see the city coming here. So constantly this limit became a theme, and for us the building could be expressed with this idea of a party wall, a wall that is simply inhabited inside. And this inhabited wall is actually the extension of the building that in a way duplicates the area that the old historical building had. As you see, the plan is also quite interesting because you see the old historical cloister, for example. It's not a square cloister. It has an angle. No, it was in a way a consequence of the presence of the rock of the mountain behind. So we had to work in this really minimal dimension, and therefore this idea of an inhabited wall became also a theme about the exterior skin and material. You see that materials in our projects, in many cases, most of the cases, become a theme related to the idea that generates it. So, for example, in this case, we asked two artists and friends, Ferran Otero, to work together with us in the development of this skin that was going to transmit this rather ambiguous theme of what is artificial and what is natural, which is in the project itself. So if you working with them, if you walk along the site and the mountain and the sea of San Sebastián and the nearby area, you will see these rocks that have perforations that happened with the passage of time, with the wind, with the water, and where sometimes you see the green comes out with this lichen and green vegetables. So the project became a way of dealing with this idea. We developed a system, again, a combinatorial system of panels. These panels are made of aluminum. These aluminum panels of 1 meter 80 times 60, so there are 3 squares. They have 4 different types of perforations. In some perforations, the green can come out. And at the end, it becomes really a sort of a pattern, again, a pattern of 4 different variations. So when you spend a little time looking to the image, for example, of the built element, you see that there is one with many perforations, another one with less, another one with less, and at the end, one with no perforations. That permits and allows us to play with this idea of the scale, because the building has a rather sculptural presence in this mountain. That is also in relation to the military 17th century constructions that you see on top of the mountain. But when you come closer, you start to perceive that these perforations play another role. They play this role of breaking the scale of the building, in which some of them will have this green coming out, some others simply transmit the light from inside out or outside in. The building is constantly playing with this idea of the space in between the old historical building and the new extension of the building that you see there. And it does it in different ways, of course, during the day and during the night, because as you see in these images, the perforations sometimes allow an artificial light to come from inside outside, and sometimes it's working exactly the other way. For us, this image is very interesting because it explains really the limit in which we had to work. So that's a reason of this extreme situation that developed into a rather extreme proposal as well. No? As a consequence of this very, very narrow site, the spaces inside are also linked to this compression and expansion of the space itself. They are made with one single material, again, the white concrete in the slabs and the walls with these wooden forms. You see that they put in relation also the old and the new through some of the windows, and they bring the natural light, again, coming from above, coming from the skylights that illuminate the spaces inside. And that define at the end a building that can be understood, and this is how this image shows, as an art installation in the city itself. Well, as you see, these questions from one project to another are dealing with different situations, but at the end refer to these themes in one way or another. And if San Telmo could be defined by this in-between space between the old and the new, we are going to show now another project in which this theme of the space, the void, is really the origin of it.
Because now we are going back to Germany, and we are going to the city of Munich. In Munich, we were invited to a restricted competition in which we had to demolish an existing building to build a new one. This existing building was a hotel, it's a hotel, that it's exactly in the center of the city. You see this white dot here, and if you see in the drawing, you see that it has a round plaza in front and behind the street. That street is a pedestrian street, and it's one of the gates of the old city of Munich. So the situation of this building is very special. This is in the 18th century, which was the outskirts of the city, and it has this cube, this house that is a single-family house, but it's like in a volume like a cube. This was demolished and built a hotel that was there till the war. Until the Second World War, this building also was destroyed by the war, and it was this new building was there, which a doubtless or a very, very doubtless architectural value. But even though it's not that beautiful, it's a very luxurious hotel of the city, and it really has a very predominant place, because this is the pedestrian street I was talking before, and this is one of the gates to the old city. If you look behind it, the only thing that you see is the existing building. And of course, the gate turns to be the frame of the building. And once that you have gone through the gate, this is the building that is really presiding the space of the plaza. So the owners of the building asked the city hall if they could demolish this existing building and build another one with a little bit more of height. We entered this competition, and immediately we understood that this building was going to be very important because of its frontality. For us, it was important to understand that we are going to be centered with the old gate of the city, and that gate was always going to be the frame of the new building. So what we decided to do was to play with the public space. We wanted the building to continue with the public space, and in that sense, what we did was a void inside the building that was going to continue with the public space, and that was going to define, in this void, it was going to be an undefined space between outside and inside. So we built this volume, this cube, around the void, and it was this void that was going to define all the space of the inside of the building. In the section, you see the void that goes running through the building, creating an atrium and relating all the spaces of the inside of the building. If we see it in the model, you see here the open model in which all of the golden space is this void that divides the building, and around it we can see how it works the rest of the building. This is this space I was speaking before, this intermediate space that connects the new building, or that will connect the new building with the city, framing the city and framing the views of it, and defining this intermediate space between in and out. So now, when the building will be built, when you walk through this street, you see behind the wall, again, this void, this public space that is going to continue in the building, the door framing it, and again here, the building, again, the presidential presiding the plaza behind the door. This building is now very advanced in planning, and well, we hope that it's going to be starting to be built maybe this year or maybe in the next 2 years. It's important also to understand the situation of the building here in this drawing, in which you see that the building is the center of the plaza and has to relate also to the Palace of Justice to the right and to these two new buildings in the left. But for us, the most important thing is to understand this void inside the building, that is the one that is really going to relate it to the center of the city, to the old part of the city. Working with the void is something that we had already done in this other building in the city of Mérida, in which the building was conceived as a volume that bended within itself, and in between the two borders also defined the view of the city. The view of the city on one direction and the view to the open space on the other direction. So again, working with the void, which is the same idea or the same concept that we had in this other building that we have just finished in the city of Madrid. This building is quite complex because of its use, because it's a multi-use building, and this is why we have here these three different volumes. One of it, the lower one, holds a market and an office space. The other one, on top of it, it's a sports space, and the third building, it's a library a library that's built in front of a public school. So here, again, we were playing with the void. And here, the void was also understood not only of the void inside the building, but also the void that was created between the different buildings that we had to build. Really, the building, what we see here, it's a container, because what we're doing is basically the outside, because the inside is basically free space, both for sports or for commercial use. The material that we were using, we are building in a very dense area of the city, so we tried to select a material that allow us to give a certain, that the building was perceived as with a light weight. So for us, as I was saying before, it's important to see this space, this void space between the volumes that we were building. One of the volumes, the market, the other one of the volumes is the new library. The library that we conceived as a bridge. As I told you before, the library was just closing a school, a public school, so we decided to build it as a bridge because like that we could extend the playground of the school and give the children the opportunity to play under the library, and also in that way to consider the building of the library as part of their school. In the market, and again, we are playing with these voids in the inside of the building. This void, which is the void that connects the streets outside to the plaza that we were creating before, and it's in this void also that the building connects to the roof. In the roof that we have created an empty space, a terrace, and in which we were trying to bring up the life of the city to up to the roof. That we hope that it will happen soon when the building is in use. Here is the space in between the volumes, and this space was conceived by us after thinking of another building, of a building that was related to this one, which is a temporary market. A building that was going to be demolished and that apparently shouldn't be very important for us, but it turned out to be one very important building because it allowed us to experiment with not only with voids, but with the different geometry games that we then applied to other buildings. So now we are in Madrid, of course, very near the market, or in the same place as the market that I was just speaking before, in which we had to build a temporary market to give space to the 113 people that were selling in the old market and that was going and that didn't have a place while we were building and demolishing the old one and building the new one. So here you see in the model the volumes that I was speaking before, the library, the market, and the sports area, and in that plaza behind it, it's the place where the city hall allowed us to build the temporary market. In the beginning, of course, they wanted us to build simply like a big tent or something like that, but that was not possible because it was a food market and we couldn't comply with the regulations. And on the other hand, we didn't want to do it like that because, as you have seen, the area of the city is very crowded. So for us, it was important to be able to have a fragmented space, so not to give that idea of a very dense situation in which we were creating an even denser situation. So what we decided to do is we resolved the building by making this geometrical pattern in which we were going to use the same figure, the pentagon, in different sizes. 3 small pentagons and another 3 big ones that were, though they were the same in the floor plan, when you see the section and the roofs, they gave they have always a different section and always a different inclination of the roof. So in this way, what we organize is a fragmented space that with the same figure, but all of them seem different. The very important space for us was the principal space for us was this interstitial space between the pentagons. This space that was an open space, only covered with a roof in order to protect from the sun and from the rain, but open, that allowed us to enter into the different pentagons in which the market was organized as a traditional market. Of course, it was a very simple construction. It was white, and all the color came actually from the marketplaces and the things that were sold there. In the outside, thinking that it was a temporary thing, we had to be very careful selecting the materials, because at the same time, we wanted to relate in a way to the building that was going to be built after, to the market. So we selected to build with this polycarbonate that also allowed us to play with the light during the night. So during the night, the light of the building really gave the artificial light of the building was the way to illuminate the whole area. So this is the temporary market, and this is the situation of a couple of months ago in which the building was really was demolished. So for us, this became a very important experiment, because we learned a lot. We learned a lot by working with this geometry, and we applied it to some other projects, like, for example, this one that we are now starting to build also in the city of Munich, which there are 5 different towers, all towers for office building and for a hotel. And I don't know if you perceive it by the photograph, but they are exactly the same floor plan. They are also pentagons used in a different way. They have exactly the same floor plan, but they have different sections, different heights in the elevation, and all the roofs are also inclined in different ways. And of course, the very important thing for us is the relation between the different pentagons and the space in between. And this is something that we are also doing now in a project that you are going to see now, which is a project that we have just won in China, and it's, again, the relation between different volumes. Or this other project in Cordoba, which was developed at the same time as the temporary market.
I will end up with these last projects that Fuensanta mentioned. Now, Cordoba is back to the city that we saw before. In Cordoba, in this case, working in front of the mosque, in the very center of the city. The Mosque of Cordoba, for us, is one of those buildings that not only are important from a historical point of view, that it is, of course, they are really important for those ideas that we are mentioning, especially today and during our own work, this idea of repetition, of combinatorial thinking, of doing a lot with just one element, for example, this double arch, of the natural light, of the geometry, etc. So the geometry of the Mosque of Cordoba that was in front of our building, and the geometry of these Islamic ornamental elements that we mentioned before were in the background of this idea. The project started with this concept. Can we really deal with these geometries of the masharabiyas, the mukarnas, and transform them into a really architectural space? So when we see the model of one of the process models after winning the competition, you see this relation that we wanted to achieve. What you see on the right is an image of Alhambra, or maybe it's Marrakesh, of one of the masharabiyas. They are maybe 10 centimeters of dimension. When you see the model that we did nearby, we are working really with large spaces for this contemporary art center. It is a contemporary art center for for visual arts. That means it's not for painting or sculpture, it's only for video art, media art, digital art. In other words, it's for rather dark spaces that can be and will be transformed by the artist. The project is conceived as a non-hierarchical space that you see in some of the sketches there, so organized by a sequence of In this case, hexagonal. The other project was pentagonal, and they have quite different, as you know, geometrical consequences, combinations. In this case, this hexagonal combination comes from a simple hexagon that is divided in 3 variations. Each of these 3 that you can follow maybe in this image of the actual plan can be combined in many different ways. They define at the end a sequence of spaces for exhibition that try to avoid the idea of the universal, flexible white box. They are really sort of factory-like spaces to which the artist will react, whether liking them or hating them. But in any case, reacting in the same way they do when they intervene in industrial buildings or in factories, as you are used to see in many video and art installations. So the section explains better the whole concept of the project. The section is the sort of inverted pyramid, almost the inverted pyramid that we used in the project in Germany at the beginning of the roofs. No? In this case, the roof becomes a negative roof that brings the light only to one point in a building that has to be rather dark. And this sequence of spaces with these inverted skylights become these exhibition spaces between the studios of the resident artists on one side and the common spaces of the museum or Kunsthalle. This is a really Kunsthalle. The building you see here in the model had also the intervention of a facade that I will explain a little bit later. And it was built and finished 2 years ago already. When you see the images of the building in front of the river Guadiana, they explain very, very clearly these geometries that are generated from in a space, but they become a roof. I mean, the roof, again, is somehow the origin of the light, the natural light, the section, and therefore of the space. Now, actually, a couple of weeks ago, we finally finished the exterior treatment that is not here in the photos, the exterior of the building, and eventually, and after 2 long years, in which a building has been without opening because of this economical crisis that happened to be in Spain and is still partially there. Eventually this year will come and start with the use. The building is also for us a way of explaining our way of thinking and working, this idea of this relation between thought and action, because in many cases they ask us which is a program, digital program that you use to develop this sort of Voronoi structures and so on. We say, no, digital program was what you see here, the hands. We started with the models like that. And these models eventually, after winning the competition, became, of course, in a tool that was developed with the computers, of course, as you can imagine, with models of other quality, with the very construction itself that is all made of concrete and rough concrete, was explaining the whole concept of the project till the end. And even the facade that I will show a little bit later is part of this same geometrical pattern. So the building establishes this relation with the landscape, in this case, the river. What you see on the right is a mosque. So for us, the presence of the mosque, like the presence of the Roman ruins in Lugo in the building before, or the presence of a painting of Feininger that we are going to show, become also part of this interest that comes together and informs the project. The building outside has an entrance which is also the negative space of these geometries, and inside is a sequence of rough concrete, well, rough, I mean, it's not so rough, it's very well built, I have to say, with wooden elements, but with this idea that it will be transformed by the interventions of the artist, or covered sometimes, or modified, but it's a very strong structure that is pure structure, pure construction. I mean, the space, it can be divided, as you may imagine in some of these images. They are hanging sort of doors or walls that can be up and down. The building has a series of perforations. Every 90 centimeters there is a perforation and space in between the walls. So that means that everything can be connected in a way or in one way or another. Of course, beamers and lights and mechanical elements and etc. As you see, sometimes the space is very compressed or sometimes it's very expanded. So the same plan, and this is something we try to do in many of our projects, a very simple plan expresses a rather complex section, as you can see in these cases. The building, again, has this presence from above, whether you see it or whether you don't see it. This is a question they ask us sometimes. Well, you don't see the roof. Why is it so important if you don't see it? I think you see it sometimes. At least we see it. And you can see this image from above because the roof expresses the geometry. Geometry expresses the idea. The idea becomes present when you go up to the roof, but it becomes present also when it becomes a patio, a courtyard, that is sort of the leftover of the geometry that in which you see only the sky above. And these courtyards and these geometries become, in another scale, the geometry of this facade. The facade became a sort of an artistic video facade developed together with a group from Berlin, Realities United, that we met years ago, and that developed together with us this media facade in which the idea is what you see there. You see only a white GRC concrete facade. You don't see glass, you don't see lights. You see simply a white GRC facade. But in the lateral, as you can see here, the trick somehow, there are these LED lamps, only white lamps. All of these balls that you see here become a pixel, so to say. At the end, there are 1,500 pixels, so that this wall can be transformed by the intervention of the artist in different ways, and it becomes, again, also a way of expressing to the exterior this concept of the building inside. Very briefly, some image of this video of Realities United explaining this functioning of this facade. And I will end up with, very briefly, with the two last projects that we have now, so to say, on the boards or on the computers or on both, which have to do also with this idea of, with these themes that we are working, and especially with this idea of using the minimum number of elements, how to deal with the different scales, with the different situations that in a global society as we live, we had to deal with. In this case, for example, it's something completely new and we were not looking for at the beginning, but it happened in China, in a very large project that we won very recently, and now we are developing already the project in Guangzhou. And in this case, we had to deal with a science museum. It was a competition for a large science museum in the center of the city of Guangzhou, a city that nowadays is like so many cities in China, growing so much with these enormous distances, dimensions, etc., that one day was this beautiful city, or at least in an idealized plan. No? It is, of course, a very idealized plan, but it's the city of Canton, now Guangzhou, and with this extreme symmetry, with this extreme order of repetition, and this idea of repeating one single element with this north-south axis that defined the city. So that was somehow present for us when we entered the competition, as compared to the new city that was not so appealing for us, or at least we had not so many routes to link to it. But on the other hand, there was this idea of how to deal with the complexity of a large-scale China project, 80,000 square meters. All the projects that we have seen, the biggest one is 12,000 or something, 14,000. Now suddenly it's a museum of 80,000 square meters. So how to deal with that? So we took to extreme this idea of, are we able to define only one thing, so to say? And in defining one thing and combining in variations, are we able to control this complexity? So it came to us this image that is linked to the Chinese culture, of course, the Chinese vases of this extremely beauty that are talking about the void, but are talking also about materiality, in this case, the ceramic, and about the possibility of having variations of the same theme. That became the origin of the project, and in a way, what we try to do is to design this sort of 9 large vases, so to say, these vases with ceramical texture that is going to be developed in a similar way to Cordoba, Zaragoza with GRC, with ceramic. We are starting now with these details of the project. But it became, and I show it here, simply a combinatorial idea of variation of 9 single cubes. These cubes, each of them is 30 meters by 30 meters by 30 meters. But of course, it could not be in another way for us. The roof becomes the way of dealing with this variation. So the roof is a rotation and a small variation of always a similar form. And at the end, the whole project becomes a play of this rotation or combination of different elements. At the end, the project has been simplified from the first version to 9 volumes, 9 cubes. So the space in between, again, this intermediate void becomes the key question of the project itself. In other words, a very simple, almost a little bit stupid plan, which is simply 9 squares, one after the other, can become a quite interesting and complex building for us, a building in which the central part is always floating. It's going to be elevated in order to create a very large lobby below, in which all the roofs are the same, but they are rotated, and they create this sort of complexity and richness of a project that is starting with a single element, in which the space in between becomes the key question of the project itself. As I said before, we are now in the beginning of this process of planning. For us, it's also a quite different scale, a different country and different culture. So it's a way of testing these ideas that we are transmitting today, or how to deal with rather large or small projects, always with this theme that we mentioned at the beginning, which is the minimum number of elements that we can use. Thank you.